very much for coming. Your name is?
I'm Ege Yumusak. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania.
Wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So, I read your work. Love it, right? Here's a couple of questions I wanted to just ask you, and then you can take it however you want to take it from there, right? You've written about salience, which is super interesting, right? But you've also written about how salience sort of activates a whole network of processes, right? Could you talk a little bit about how you think that works?
Yes, for sure. I came to work on salience through an interesting route. I was a little bit discontent with discussions that were happening around implicit bias. So let me take you back to 2016. Even Hillary Clinton was mentioning implicit bias as a way in which our psychologies absorbed political content and reflected it back to us. So philosophers became interested in this idea that there could be things that are a little bit deeper than belief that structure our experience. And they had many different proposals about how to characterize these things that are sort of clandestine. I like to call them clandestine contents of perception.
They're a bit sneaky.
They're a bit sneaky.
Yeah.
A lot of people disavow them.
Yeah.
When they're told that this is a feature of their experience, they want to say, "I'm not committed to that." All of this is well explained by many philosophers, but I thought one part of this experience that was missing was how these clandestine contents made certain aspects of the world less or more salient to us in a systematic manner. So even before committing to propositions such as this is how things are, we were selecting information in very particular ways, and I wanted to focus on that. So at that moment of selection of information from the world of experience, which is very rich and full of different data, and we as subjects, we have portals to that. We are portals to that experience, and we pick and choose what we see as relevant.
Yeah, we
so
pick and choose enormously.
Salience to me is the phenomenological access to relevance that is psychologically embodied. So that's how I became interested in salience. I thought that was the explanatory locus that we should be focusing on if we are interested in these things, clandestine contents that are of political importance and social importance in some manner.
Yeah. So you see it, right? So there's this plethora of data that comes at us, right? And we kind of pick and choose, both consciously and unconsciously, right? Can you talk about how they both operate, what you think the percentages of each are, which is more nefarious than the other? Could you talk a little bit about that?
For sure. I think parts of that question are probably better answered by social psychologists who are looking at how unconscious processes affect our perceptual experience. But something we philosophers can bring to the table is a better understanding of how to delineate the unconscious and the conscious aspects of experience. Something I came to explore more in my work is how seeing something as salient might activate a lot of unconscious processing, but this processing happens to be a lot of the time quite domain specific. The associative and the inferential relations that get activated all funnel us towards answering questions. So I like to think about salient objects as presenting epistemic opportunities to us. So I think they afford interaction, and our mind, driven to make sense of the world, latches onto these epistemic opportunities, activates domain-specific knowledge that we already have, and a lot of unconscious processing goes into us finding bits and pieces relevant from one moment to the next so that we start making sense of the world.
Can you give me an example of domain-specific instances?
For sure. So I have this fictional example that I really like because it's kind of funny. Queen Elizabeth watches the David Attenborough documentary Blue Planet 2 or something. I'm not very up to date on which blue planet they're on. And she becomes an environmentalist. There's some truth to this story. I did actually read a news article about Queen Elizabeth becoming interested in environmentalism at the time. This is obviously many years ago, as she has passed since then. So Elizabeth watches this documentary, suddenly becomes interested in environmentalism, and then walking around Buckingham Palace, she starts noticing lights that are not turned on, straws, plastic straws that might be used on royal property. What I mean by domain-specific information is that given her now background knowledge about the climate crisis, in seeing just inanimate objects in the world, she activates knowledge that relates to those objects, such as plastic straws contribute to pollution, or things like this start to come to her mind, precisely because the salient object, the object that is now salient to her, which wouldn't have been prior to her change of focal consciousness, presents an epistemic opportunity to engage with.
Right. Right, and so now she's not only noticing something that she hadn't noticed before, but it actually plays a role in her constitutive content about that subject, right? So now she's actually forming a new kind of epistemic world. Horizon is a better way.
Because I think Husserl was the first person to actually think about perception in a forward-looking manner. A lot of philosophy of perception initially was concerned with what I characterize as backward-looking theory. So we take the world, we ask, what does the subject come to know, given that this is the world that it's engaging in, and not what position does the subject put themselves in to access new knowledge.
Right.
Whereas Husserl has this notion of a horizon.
Yeah.
The object, in seeing the object, the subject also got in touch with horizons, the things that are not present in the moment of perception, but appearances that the subject will come to know. So the back of a cube or something. That is present, he believes, as a horizon of the object perceived, even though presently the subject is not perceiving the back of the cube, or the back. I'm not perceiving this side of the puppet, but it's present to me in perception as a horizon. That's what Husserl talked about, because he was interested in the distinction between the thing and experience, Erlebnis, and he wanted to say that in trying to understand our perceptions, we swim after our experience. So we are trying to get in touch with different dimensions of experience, which is a process that unfolds over time.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, he talked about astonishment too. I mean, can you relate his notion of astonishment to this sort of perceptual activity?
Tell me more about what he said about astonishment.
So when we bracket, right, that process of bracketing, which is really kind of a first-person experience, right, involves in it that sort of astonishment of the phenomena, right? So I think that when you attend to something carefully, right, when it doesn't just sort of glaze by you, right? You're able to sort of grasp it in that sort of bracketed way and experience the astonishment of the phenomenon. But I think that what you're talking about with Elizabeth, for example, right, is someone actually is attending to facets of the environment that they hadn't attended to before, right? So I think that there is not maybe Husserl's notion of astonishment there, but there is a kind of astonishment that, I never noticed that before, and that's obviously a huge, important thing. And so now their world is rewritten for them.
Right. There's a new confrontation with the world.
Yeah. And the constituents of that world have changed enormously.
Yes. I think this is the place in which Husserl is not helpful to us, but maybe Gibson is.
Okay, Gibson is great. Yeah.
Because sure, Husserl talked about horizons, but the next person, I think, in line who talked about forward-looking aspects of perceptual experience was Ege Gibson, who was interested in what the environment afforded to us.
Yeah.
And a lot of people who work on Gibson, I think, focus solely on skill-based affordances, how for the tennis player, the ball approaching affords a certain kind of hitting, a forehand or a backhand or a slice. A lot of people are very interested in how perceiving affordances might be an important step in skill development. But Gibson wasn't just interested in skill.
Yeah, not at all.
He was also interested in how the mailbox afforded sending a letter to a loved one.
Yeah.
He was interested in how the social world came to present opportunities to us and invited us to interact with it. So I think maybe that is more...
The thing I love about Gibson is that he seems to just, I don't know, just like wipe away this sort of passivity of the old empirical story, where the observer, I always think of it as empiricism as like, those flat sponges that you have as children, and then it becomes, you put it in water and it becomes a dinosaur, right? That sort of empiricism to me. So we're just like these like flat sponges, and then we just absorb the world, right? And the Gibson story that was so wonderful was, it goes like this. It's this very back and forth thing, right? And so we don't just have this knowledge and then decide intellectually to act, right? It is, this object is there in front of me, and it is a kind of visceral, almost, perceptual thing that goes on. So I don't just perceive it in a very dry, factual way, but I think of it in terms of how it affects me and how I want to affect it. And so I loved the sort of very fluid, in time story that Gibson tells, which is not a static story at all.
Perhaps we should say the Gibsons, because his wife was also engaged with some of this work.
Yeah, oh my God. What a terrible omission that we've all made.
Exactly.
Yes,
and Eleanor Gibson, I think one of my favorite papers, actually, she's either the primary author or the sole author on. And in that particular paper, they talk about the ecological theory being focused on perception being an event, which is another aspect of it, of the Gibsonian theory of perception that I really appreciate. As you're describing, perceiving is an event. It's something that happens over time, and if we lose sight of that, we also will lose sight of how our perceivings change, evolve over time.
Yes, you had a footnote, right? You had a footnote in the paper about Elizabeth Camp, talking about how things... Can you talk a little bit about that? The Camp notion of things changing over time? And what you think about that and how that might affect the transparency thesis?
Right. Liz Camp has this notion of a perspective, and for her, perspectives are intuitive modes of knowing, getting to know the world. And perspectives involve dispositions to attend to things, dispositions to see things as central. So she wants to say that we put on a perspective in order to understand the world, to interact with the world. And this is the way in which our knowing the world unfolds over time, because we engage with it by activating these dispositions. And I think she refers to a quote by Wittgenstein about how our perspectives are about how we find our way through a domain. Again, like this active notion of coming to know the world. Knowing the world is something we do, and something we can be accountable for, because we do it, because we find ourselves doing it, and we can have self-knowledge about that.
This is a slight detour, and it just sort of came to my mind, and we don't have to go in this direction, but so to be accountable for it. So if you take the Wittgensteinian notion of implicit knowledge, right, that we kind of know inductively because we play the game, right? So rules are not explicitly spelled out, but we implicitly play them. And then go back to what you were talking about in the first with Hillary Clinton and implicit biases, right? So some of our implicit biases have come to us not consciously necessarily, but unconsciously a lot of times, because we're in a certain kind of environment with certain kinds of people, right? So the language game that we've played has given us certain kinds of implicit biases in that way, right? So then how is it then that we become responsible, this is kind of a devil's advocate thing, but I think you'll probably do it, right? How is it that then we become reflective, right? It's a responsibility. We are responsible for all of the attitudes that we have, all the ways that we stand to the world, whether we've gotten those unconsciously or consciously, right? But then how do we do that? This is what do you think?
A lot of ink has been spilled over this question in the last decade almost, with the boom in implicit cognition research program and philosophers' interest in it. I have never been someone who's too interested in individual responsibility.
Yeah, me neither. So I said, we don't have to go in this way, but it just dawned on me, like it's a problem, right?
But I think individuals do have resources. There are moments of alienation, there are moments where the game is disrupted, and there are societal sphere is as homogenous as we would like to believe. There are always people who are not playing the game. I think part of the reason why philosophers and academics in particular thought this way of thinking about responsibility was I guess, despair-inducing was because they see themselves in a monoculture.
That's a good point.
And they might be in some ways. But the rest of the world is not existing in a monoculture.
And so it's the attentiveness, again, about attention, right? It's the attentiveness to other perspectives that might then conflict with our own perspective, and it's our responsibility to sort of stand back and measure those things.
It's easy to step out of the game.
It's easy to step out,
And we sometimes take a misstep unknowingly, even when we are playing the game. We fail to notice something that we were taught to notice. And then people respond to us, why have you not noticed that?
Right.
So this type of experience, in fact, is something that I'm very interested in. I call these perspectival clashes.
Right.
I think often enough in interpersonal experience we come to these moments where we don't even know what we're disagreeing over. There isn't something that is immediately contested, but we feel epistemically alienated from one another precisely because we see different things as salient. An example of this...
I was going to say, give me an example. Great.
I'll give you an example. I was walking down... I used to live in Flatbush. One day, the New York City Police Department installed some floodlights in front of my building, and I was obviously very enraged by this diesel-powered, loud, and bright machine suddenly appearing on my doorstep. And I mentioned this to a friend of mine. I pointed out, I made it salient to my friend that this thing had appeared. And my friend, not being from New York City, not knowing the particular political environment that we're in, especially since the George Floyd protests, thought it was strange that I would find it salient that object was there. The moment at which we disconnected wasn't a disagreement. She hadn't yet formed views about what this thing is, what its proper function is, and whether it's some sort of hazard to me or to the community. But we fell out of step. So these moments, I think, are moments in which we leave the game, and we ask a meta-level question: why is this thing salient to me?
Right.
And that is a moment in which we can go searching for commitments we do have. They might be beliefs, desires, interests, practical interests, economic interests, and we can go searching for them. So I call these perspectival clashes that happen over what's salient to us, and I like to analyze them as two people asking different questions, because I think questions are sort of an interesting linguistic animal to play with in this arena. Being committed to a question is not the same thing as being committed to a belief. So I think in seeing something as salient, we commit ourselves to questions. We commit ourselves to asking something about an object epistemically more directly, and then sometimes we might be committed to our beliefs or whatever, but in the moment of seeing something as relevant, we see it as answering a question.
You've written a little bit about feminist perspectives, right?
Yeah.
So what kind of questions do you think that a feminist perspective would be based on?
Yeah. There are many kinds of feminists, right? But one thing they share is a commitment to understanding how gendered oppression plays out in society. So I like to analyze the core constituent of a feminist perspective as a commitment to this question. How does a society enact gendered oppression? And I don't think it's one question.
Right.
I think it's a body of questions.
It's a body of questions, right.
But a Marxist feminist, a liberal feminist, a fascist feminist, these people might, maybe fascist feminists, not so much. That might be a contradiction.
Yeah.
But a lot of feminists across the political spectrum might see themselves as committed to this question.
Yeah, and what kind of variations of that question would you think would be in that suite of questions?
I think we could analyze the internal coherence of someone's these bodies of questions, and different feminists might pride themselves for having a better research programs, let's say. But I think the questions will range from questions about how to enact social change to how to interpret lived phenomena. And every feminist will have some set of these questions on their mind, implicitly or explicitly.
So questions like, does that act constitute sexual harassment?
Exactly.
So if you have that question in your head, you're going to have a certain kind of perspective, right, that somebody's not going to have who doesn't have that question on their mind.
And
right?
you can have that question on your mind without having that vocabulary.
Yeah.
You can find it salient that a woman is being interrupted while they're speaking.
Right.
It's
like Elizabeth with the plastic straws.
Exactly.
Did you notice that? Did you not notice that?
Exactly.
Right.
So I think the salient structures that we inhabit are realized as commitments to questions. These questions, again, might be questions that I avow, that I have chosen, but also these questions might have snuck in my mind. They might be already filtering out my experience and helping me see things as relevant or not relevant.
Yeah. So filters, I've thought a lot about that idea, right? So can you talk a little bit about perception as a kind of filtering process?
Mm-hmm. So perception, I think, is helpfully thought of as a filtering process precisely because we don't see everything that we're confronted with at a given moment.
Yeah. What percentage do you think we see? I've often debated this. Nobody knows, right? Nobody knows. Nobody knows, but I have 10 in my head.
You have 10 in your head?
10%.
Tell me how you got to that number.
Well, because I sort of like look and go, oh, I didn't see that. Oh, I didn't see that. So I've just like, as a painter, right? I look at things long time and very closely.
Yeah.
And so the amount of additional information that I get the longer I look is astounding. Mm-hmm. And so I start out with just like a tiny, so I just kind of ran, I was like, I don't know, it seems like 10. I don't know.
I think I would put it, I think we might have to set the parameters in a specific way, because if we want to go to determinant properties, like if we want to say seeing hues and stuff, we're going to 0.001.
No, I was going to say,
we're not seeing anything.
Yeah, right, that would be like way down there.
Yeah, that would be way down there. So I think if we stick to ordinary objects and like common hues, maybe recognizable sounds, maybe we're higher than 10.
You think higher?
Maybe. I mean, at that level, if we define the natural in some manner where we're not trying to...
Although I don't know, maybe I don't know. I just see that I don't see a lot of times, I'm not expecting to see it. It wasn't important to me. It didn't register on me. Mm-hmm. All sorts of things. It's just, it's astounding to me how much I don't see. And I'm a very, pointedly visual person. So...
For sure.
I don't know. But anyway, filters. So...
Yeah, filters. Personally, I'm more interested in political filters. things that become visible, just like the Queen Elizabeth example is a fine case, but there are also other, the feminist example is another one, but changes of political consciousness, making different things visible to you, suddenly noticing these floodlights that the New York City Police Department uses as a way to harass and terrorize poor communities, or noticing different aspects of everyday life, which might show you opportunities to engage in solidarity work. All of these things are, they are filtered. They are filtered through our perception too in the social world, and these aspects of the filtering are under-theorized because now actually there's a growing interest in working in this perception and politics interface. But our heroes, like Husserl and Gibson, they were interested in the social world to a certain extent, but they weren't interested in politics. Yeah. So a lot of my heroes are analytic Marxists who have been invested in political psychology in some way, like Jon Elster, or to some extent, there's some stuff in Lukács. I keep searching for people who want to think about how our investment in seeing the political reality in a certain way filters through our perceived perceptions of the world. And I think Sartre has recently been a good source for me in this regard. And yeah, so that's how I'm interested in reanimating some ideas in philosophy of perception.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
And so what direction are you thinking your own research is going to go into?
I'm very interested in the interpersonal domain because of my investment in seeing perception as something that happens in interaction with the world. So I am interested in how we can better analyze how people interact with one another. So this is starting with perception in social reality. I want to figure out a better taxonomy of thinking about interpersonal conflict that takes into account our the perceptual realities that we live in. So perspectival clashes is one example of this, where I think the way we can fall out of step with one another when we engage in this regressive analysis of going back to the beginning of conflict. It actually starts by seeing the world differently, and seeing different things as saliently rather than disagreeing with one another. If we start our understanding of conflict at the level of disagreement, then we're going to right away stop noticing a lot of epistemic indeterminacy in people's psychology.
Yeah, I agree.
We are not committed to too many things. A lot of us are very confused, but we still enter adversarial relationships, particularly over these misalignments of finding things as salient. Our ways of knowing are so different before we even get to knowledge or things that we take as knowledge. So I'm interested in disagreements prior to disagreements, conflicts prior to disagreements that happen.
The groundwork that set it up.
Because I think if we don't attend to that, we're already giving up on consciousness raising. Yeah. We're already giving up on organizing and important aspects of persuasion, important aspects of constructing new identities, so that we can perhaps entertain similar dreams of what a just world might be like.
Can I give that back to you and then tell me if I've got it right? Right. So it seems to me, right, that you've broken pretty radically with the traditional epistemological project, which before 1960s saw epistemology as an individual act, right? We perceive the world. And we did it correctly or incorrectly. And so it was very propositional, sort of like true false, right? And so you're going, no. Actually, perception is a very filtered thing, right? We're very porous. Our perceptual processes are very porous. Our ability to know accuracy is often compromised in ways that we don't know, right? And so we have these conflicts with people that aren't necessarily factual conflicts, even though we think they're factual conflicts. They're really based in sort of the prior process of filtering and failing to see some of the things that other people saw. Right? And so maybe the way around that isn't arguing about the facts of the matter, even if they're social facts, but about framing the problem in terms of questions. And if we can figure out what questions are motivating each other, then we can then perhaps get to the saliency map of that other person, right? And then compare their saliency map with our saliency map and come to some kind of compromise that then obviates the conflict. Is that about right?
I don't talk that much about compromise. It's not like I believe too greatly on compromise. I have my suspicions, but I am committed to everything you said before.
All right.
So I am interested in this thing that I call a zetetic alignment over a particular question, and I think putting on the perspective of another is embodying their questions and seeing things that are salient to them as salient to you. I think this is part of what happens when we empathize with others. The emancipatory potential of that seeing, I'm not banking on necessarily, but I think in moments in which we do find successful consciousness raising projects, and here I take as a source Paulo Freire's work in Chile during land reform, where he was engaged in, critical education projects where people imagine things together and put on perspectives together. I think a lot of these projects that do work involve this sort of zetetic alignment.
I think art does that in general.
For sure.
I think that's what art's all about.
For sure.
Yeah. It's a way of standing to the world differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this is the interpersonal domain. I'm also a materialist. I'm a materialist who's interested in psychology, and this is sort of like an animating dilemma in my work. I do like the interpersonal, I do like psychoanalysis, I do like to think about these things, but at the same time, I'm always skeptical about how much we can scale up from that. But still, it's I think a domain of understanding that is important to us, and there's a lot of confusing psychologizing that happens in the political arena. Like, for example, these days, a lot of political pundits like to talk about how a particular society is polarized. Again, this is an epistemically flattening view of the world. People are sorted out into two poles as if they are epistemically determined, whereas what we find is that their interests might be determined, but their psychologies are not as determined as we might want to think. So I think there is some political importance to thinking about the interpersonal more deeply, thinking about the psychological more deeply. But it's unclear how much work is there and how much work is elsewhere.
Yeah. All right. So we won't replace the UN. That may be true, right? It's a great project. Thank you so much for coming and talking about it.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was very fun.
Good.